The Olympics is the oldest recurring event in human history. It has survived the fall of empires and the rise of Christianity and two world. Today we are tracing back the entire history of the Olympic Games. You can't see her, but she's adorable. Hi, I'm Ava, and this is Caelia. Welcome to Ava Sports Talk. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports history and if you want to see more of it. First, we will start with the ancient. So this would be 776 before Christ to 393 after. So the very first recorded Olympic Games took place in 776 before Christ in Olympia, Greece. At this point, they were not just a sports competition like they are today. They were a festival for a deity, for Zeus. During the month of the Games, during the month of the game, a sacred truce was declared, called Caelia, and all wars between the different Greek city-states were halted during the month of the game to allow athletes and spectators to travel safely to Olympia from all sides of Greece. For the first 13 Olympics, there was only one event, the stadium, which is actually a sprint for 190 meters, close to 100 meters. I'm not sure what that is in feet, yard. I'll write it somewhere on the screen what it is. Eventually, they added the diolos, or two-lap race, and then the dolichos. I hate that I know Latin, but I do not, so not very helpful for this, which is a long distance run. And then they had wrestling, boxing, and then pankration, which is a brutal combat sport that they had in ancient. And basically, the only rule of the pankration is no eye gouging, which is terrifying. Although, complete side note, if I do recall, we do still have a sport that exists that has similarly very little to no rules. I do not 100% recall. I've only seen a documentary on it once, and I haven't done any extra research about it. I haven't done any particular research on that sport. I just remember seeing a documentary probably a decade ago on Arte about it. Arte, which, if you're not French or German, is a channel that is available, which is a Franco-German channel, mostly on cultural stuff, films, documentaries, etc. So it's called Arte, and that was my favorite channel growing up. Side note, closed. In the Olympic Games, for the participation, at least at the beginning, only free-born men that were Greek could participate. So anybody else could not participate. It was purely a Greek competition. Again, Greece was a little different at the time. They were lost city-states, so technically it was still an international competition, but it was only free-born Greek men. Let's just say that athletes participated with minimal clothing at the time. I love bribing her with treats. And these initial games ended after the Romans progressively conquered Greece. So this is in about 393 AD, or in the 390-ish ADs. And it is the Emperor Theodosius that officially banned the games as part of a campaign to eliminate pagan festivals and establish Christianity within the Roman Empire as a state religion. The Olympics remained basically dead for about 15. Finally, we get to the rebirth of the Olympics. In the late 19th century, there is a rebirth for the interest on physical education, and a lot of interest on everything that was ancient Greece as well. Le Baron Pierre de Coubertin, which founded the IOC, or International Olympic Committee, in 1894, is in part at the origin of the Olympics starting again. The first modern games were in 1896 in Athens, so we're going back very close to where they originated. These first games had 241 athletes from 14 different countries, and the highlight was the first ever marathon that was won by a Greek water carrier named Spurgeon Lewis. For a few years, the Olympics, although they were back, were not quite the shine or the best event that you would have in your country. They were often overshadowed by the World Fairs that were happening at the time, and I believe still happen. They're just less important now than the Olympics. Side note, it was during a World Fair that the Eiffel Tower was built, or it was for a World Fair that the Eiffel Tower was built, and I do believe that part of the Statue of Liberty was also exposed at a World Fair. So the 1900 games in Paris and the 1904 games in St. Louis were pretty disorganized, overshadowed by other events. They lasted way too long, lacked central stadium. They were not really doing it for the Olympics and almost killed the Olympic movement because they were just not a success. World fairs were so much more successful at this point. The very first organized game, or considered organized games, were the 1912 Stockholm Games, and these were kind of the games as we see them today. The Stockholm Games introduced the decathlon and the pentathlon. It was also the very first time that athletes from all 5 inhabited continents got to compete. Obviously, World War I from 1914 to 1918 meant there was a break in the Olympics at this point. The Olympics came back in 1920 in Antwerp. This is when the Games resumed after World War I. This is also when the Olympic flag was flown for the very first time, the 5 rings that we still have today, and that the Olympic oath was introduced in order to restore a sense of unity after the war. In 1924, we have the very first Winter Olympics, or the first Winter Olympics that were separated from the Summer Olympics, because until then, the winter sports happened in the Summer Olympics. I know it makes very little sense, but it was the case. This was the very, very first Winter Olympics, was in 1924. Because they were so successful, this is when the IOC decided to just make it an event, and from then on there were the Summer and the Winter Olympics that were separated, even though these specific ones were 4 years after the Summer Olympics. The 2 year in between each would come much later. And these games were in Chamonix in France. The very first televised Olympic Games were in Berlin in 1936, and we all know what was going on in Germany at that time. This is also the very first year there was the Olympic relay, or torch relay, that we still have today. Interestingly, during these games, the Nazi regime was intending to have a huge showcase of Aryan superiority. They were really hoping these games would just showcase how they were right on everything, which made it ironic when Jesse Owens, an African-American sprinter, won 4 gold medals, and he basically became the face of the Berlin Games, and he's basically everything we remember of the Berlin Games even to this day. Obviously, 4 years later is 1940. There's no games at this point because we have the 1939 to 1945 war, the Second World War, which obviously no Olympics during that time. And when finally the games returned in 1948, they were considered austerity games because, well, the city of London was still recovering from the Blitz. The Blitzkrieg, the whole rest of the world was still recovering from World War II, and so they were considered austerity games. Relatively quickly after that, the world entered in yet again another type of war. This time it was the Cold War between the United States, or the capitalist side, and the communist bloc. In 1952, the Soviet Union joined the Olympics for the very first time, turning the games into a symbolic battleground for the Cold War. And for the 40 following years of Olympics, the medal count would count as a proxy of political power. In Rome in 1960, we have the very first Paralympic Games. I have a whole video planned on the Paralympic Games history next week, so I'm not going to be talking too much about it but basically, the very first Paralympic Games were held in 1960 in Rome, following immediately the Summer Olympics. In 1980, there were the Moscow Games, which led the US and 66 other countries to boycott the game, to protest the invasion of Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union retaliated later by boycotting the 1984 Los Angeles Games. In Barcelona in 1992, we have kind of the professional revolution when now we're not only seeing amateur players of all of the sports, but professionals come in. What's my puppy doing? And so these 1992 games had NBA players like Michael Jordan or Magic Johnson. This ended the amateur-only rule, allowing the world's best athletes to actually participate in the Olympics. Finally, we have the modern games, which there's a whole bunch of stuff that happened, but 2000 games in Sydney were very much considered the best organized games so far. They focused on environmental sustainability, on reconciliation between the Aboriginal and the non-Aboriginal Australians. The Sydney Games were really seen as a benchmark of how a game should be organized. And a lot of the more recent games are benchmarking how Sydney did it in 2000. The next big drama that happened in the Olympics, so we didn't have that many big drama in the Olympics going on in between 2000 and then 2020. So because of COVID-19, which we all lived through, the 2020-2021, the Tokyo Olympics were actually postponed a year, and that was the very first time in history that it has happened that Olympics were moved a year and not just canceled. And so basically they were held a year later, the competition doesn't still happen, but basically they had no spectators. And this is again a side note business-wise, but the Olympics are incredibly expensive to organize for countries because they have to build new arenas, they have to house the athletes, there's so much to do for the countries, and the tourism that comes from organizing the Olympics is a big way these countries make back the money that they've spent on organizing them. So for the Japanese government, it has to have been financially a very difficult thing to have to organize the 2020-2021 Olympics with very little spectators to fill in basically, and to not have the tourism that would normally come from the Olympics. Finally, in the very last Olympics in 2024, which were the Paris Olympics, we've seen a few more modern sports come up, including breakdancing, which seemed like it's not going to be coming back in 2028. I guess that was not too much of a success, but they tried. They've tried bringing more modern urban sports to the Olympics. I like seeing expansions of the sports available. There's so many different sports that would be amazing at the Olympics. I have to say from more or less experience, it's not really experience, that I would love to see vaulting, which if you're not aware of what vaulting is basically gymnastics on a horse. And I'm a horse rider. I've done dressage for a very long time, and I would love to see vaulting. It's not exactly the discipline I do. The dressage is at the Olympics already, but vaulting is just literally gymnastics on a horse. I don't see what could be more Olympic than that, so I really hope that one day they add vaulting at the Olympics, but I'm not sure they would want to add more equestrian sports at the Olympics, so hey. That's basically the Olympics history made short. If you want even further deep dive where I go Olympic by Olympic, I could technically do this at some point. I just figured that before the Olympic season start, it would be good to have a little mind refresh on how the Olympics got to where they are now. To think that it started with a single sport as a religious activity and is now this massive international sports competition is pretty amazing. I am excited to see the Winter Olympics in a few weeks and the Winter Paralympics in a few weeks. Thank you so much for sticking with me through the history of the Olympic Games. If you like historical retrospective, sorry, I got distracted for a second. If you like historical retrospectives on sports, please subscribe, and you can also follow us on Instagram. I post shorts and everything every week, and including little posts with updates and fun facts about hockey and sled hockey, so please follow that. And finally, may your team score many goals this week. Bye!